Vasile, you're muted for me.
Thank you, thank you, thank
There
you.
you go.
Okay, I will start from the beginning. Thank you very much. So, hello everyone. Welcome to Apologetica Creștinismului Pur. My name is Vasile Sambor, and today we will have a very interesting discussion. I want to mention that on this channel we usually do Romanian content and mostly Romanian content. But since today we have a very special guest from California, we will be having this discussion in English. So, without any further ado, let me introduce my guest, Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. Is a research professor of philosophy at Azusa Pacific University, California. He works in analytics metaphysics with a focus on basic category of reality, such as objects, ideas, and necessary existence, with his interest in mind and philosophy of religion. He is the author of several books, including Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth, Necessary Existence, Is God the Best Explanation of Things, and How Reason Can Lead to God. He's also the founder of YouTube channel called Worldview Design, which helps people use reason to address the big questions of life. I have one of his books right here, Necessary Existence, which is co-authored with Dr. Alexander Prus. It's a very interesting book, and for other books and work, you can find it in the description below, and please check it out. I also want to mention that at the end of this stream, our group is offering as a giveaway a book of Joshua called How Reason Can Lead to God. So for those who subscribe on our group on Facebook, I will have an extraction at the end. I will pick up a winner randomly. That's all. So now, Josh, if you would like to present yourself a bit more and tell us a bit about you, about what are you focused right now since you are a professional philosopher, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that introduction. It's so good to be with you. Glad to be on your show. So, yeah, recently I've been focusing on the nature of consciousness, what it is to have feelings and thoughts, and then the ultimate origin of consciousness. So, I'm working on a book on the title is Who Are You Really? On the nature and origin of consciousness. So, that's my main project now. But this fits out of my general interest in trying to understand the foundations of things. I want to understand things at the deepest level. So my work in How Reason Can Lead to God, you can think of it as philosophy of religion, but you could also think of it as a metaphysical inquiry into the basic nature of existence. What is the foundational layer of existence? Can we investigate it using reason? And actually, that's what I'm going to be talking about today with you all about how we can uncover the foundation of existence. So yeah, that's basically who I am. I am a curious person. I'm always trying to think about things from new angles, trying to go deeper really, I want to get to truths that can serve people, truths that can be treasures to people, things that can help people in their life, but are also based in reality. I think that combination is important. I think sometimes philosophers, we get kind of focused on maybe seeking after truths, but sometimes we lose sight about, which truths are really the most relevant to the questions people are asking. And then other times you can fall off on another side where you try to find out things that maybe are relevant, but you lose sight of, okay, what's actually true? Like, what is reality actually like? And so I like to find the intersection between truths and treasures, truths that can serve people.
Okay, thank you. I would like if you want to tell us a bit about your story, how you went to the skepticism and then back to truth seeker, as you say. So just shortly, if you would like, that would be great.
Yeah. So when I was growing up, I didn't have initially too many friends who were outside of my original worldview. So my original worldview included a positive vision of life where reality is fundamentally good and intelligent and caring. But later, when I was in high school, I began to have some friends who had a different view. And this invited me to really think about things for myself, to think about things from new angles. I remember also reading articles from scientists and then books from atheist philosophers. And this really challenged my worldview. It caused me to wonder, well, how can I really know what's true? And I would say most fundamentally, this led me to what you said, to really want to find out the truth, to become a truth seeker. And as I began to seek after the truth, this led me to discover two things. First, that reality is bigger and more complex than my initial worldview, which of course is always the case. I mean, reality is always bigger and more complex than any current view, I think, than anybody has. So that's a humbling thing. And then second, I found that there are good pathways of reason, good evidence for uncovering a positive vision of reality that I actually think was bigger than the original view that I had, and actually includes more details, more data points. So in that way, I return towards a view that reality is fundamentally good, is fundamentally intelligent, does care about you, and so there's reason for optimism. But this is based on a wider scope of data. So that's kind of, the short story of sort of how my worldview fell apart and how it led me to really become passionate about seeking the truth.
Okay, thank you, George. So now this topic of this discussion was arguments for God. Uh, if you would like to present a list of arguments, maybe, and then just pick one which you think it's one of the thing you would like to present this evening, and show us maybe some slides as you prefer.
Yeah, sure. So you can sort of think of the general inquiry into reality. One way of doing this is to think of it in terms of what's sort of the best explanation of the things that we see in the world. So, what are some things that we see in the world? Well, we see ourselves as creatures that have lots of interesting features. Uh, One of our features is that if we hurt ourselves, there's self-repairing technologies right within our own bodies, which is quite interesting. We also have a sense of consciousness. This has been my recent work thinking about what consciousness is, a sense of right and wrong. There's also principles of reason that allow us to find out necessary truths about the world. And so, one way of thinking about the world is to think, okay, what hypothesis best explains all the things we observe? Complexity, sense of right and wrong, reason, the power to reason. And so there's a set of arguments there from these things that we observe. And you can make the argument that the best explanation of all these things is in terms of a foundational reality that itself has the resources for explaining why there would be a moral sense, why there would be complexity, why there would be principles of reason. And I'll talk more about this in my slides about how, if we think of this foundational reality as having a supreme nature, that's going to successfully predict that it has these resources to explain all these different dimensions of reality. It provides what you might call a simple explanation with wide predictive success. And so in science, we're looking for hypotheses that have wide predictive success in the simplest way without positing unnecessary extra complexities. And so I'm applying that same kind of principle of reasoning to my investigation of large scale theories of the world, including the foundation of reality. So today, what we're going to look into more is a more general question about why anything exists and how God can provide an account or an explanation of how anything at all can exist. So we're going to uncover that in a little bit of detail.
Just a question: the argument you're
Yeah.
going to present, is it related to the bridge of reason you want, or is
Yes.
something? Is it the same?
Yeah, it's grows out of that work, The Bridge of Reason. It's going to be an argument from Contingency.
Okay,
That's right.
so while you are putting your slides, I will ask our audience if they have any questions during your presentation. I would like to address them if it's okay for you during the presentation, so I can put them directly on the screen and you can handle them directly. Is that okay for you?
That sounds wonderful. That sounds perfect
Okay,
to
that's
have it
good.
kind of interactive. Yes. Can you see my screen on the my slides on the screen?
Not yet. If you would like to,
Okay.
I don't see them yet.
Okay. Let me have a look here again. Okay, I'm finding where I can upload the slides. I'm going to do that right now.
If you want, I can share them on my computer, but
It's uploading. So I know previously we tested this and that window for sharing was gray again. So I'm not so sure, but I found another link where I can upload the slides directly. So it's
okay.
doing that right now.
Meanwhile, you have a question already.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
So
You said the world is enough to explain itself for rationality. Was it 70 minutes
I
in
think
time in the dinosaurs?
I don't quite understand what he wants to say at the end. I don't know if you get it.
I'm not quite sure I understand that second part of the question. If you want to clarify, that would be great. But in terms of rationality, you can think of sort of two fundamentally different worldviews in terms of explaining rationality. One worldview has it that mind is somehow foundational to reality, and then from mind come the products of mind, including rationality, as well as the resources for producing other beings that can reason. Whereas if you have instead a foundation that is mindless, then I think you have a much harder time explaining how any kind of rationality could arise in the first place. Now, in terms of the dinosaurs, I'd have to see a
He,
little
cla-
bit more about what you're asking. Yeah, go ahead.
he clarified. It says that it's million of years. So was it 70 millions of years in times in dinosaurs? I still don't understand, even if he clarifies the millions of years.
Yeah, so I think that in terms of the time scales,
Okay. He said that 70 millions ago there was no mind to grasp, since there was no human or something like that. His meaning, I guess.
sure, yeah. So in the philosophy of mind, there's this debate about whether reality consists fundamentally of the powers of a mind out of which the entire universe arises, as well as the fine tuning of the universe. On this model, 70 million years ago, while there are dinosaurs, in order for there to even be the biological complexity of dinosaurs, there would need to be a certain kind of fine tuned universe that provides an environment so that these creatures can evolve. So, on this model, the very fine tuning of the environment itself depends on the rationality of a foundational mind, a mind that's foundational to the rest of reality. So, in that way, there would actually be a mind. It's just prior to the very environment of those dinosaurs, if that makes sense. This leaves open a wide range of options in terms of how reality unfolds, how creation takes place. But it allows us to explain the sort of the intelligibility of the world, our ability to even reason about the world in terms of a design plan rather than in terms of just sort of mindless chance products. Ultimately, in terms of the very explanation of the environment itself, because I think sometimes people get into these debates about evolution and we can sidestep those debates entirely because the question here is about how there can be even any kind of fine-tuned environment in which any kind of complex adaptive structures can result into rational beings who can think and reflect. And so there, a mind first ontology provides predictive resources to explain that would be missing on a mindless ontology. Now, this is just the beginning of a larger inquiry.
He seems
But
satisfied. He said,
yes,
"Thank you." So,
I'll just
okay,
keep talking. Okay,
we
so it looks like
we
my
have
slides are
we have the
there.
slides. We have the
Yes.
slides, and there are other questions popping. I think I will later with the slides first, and then I will interrupt you later with the questions. Okay.
Okay, that
So
sounds
here
good.
are the slides. I think you have. Let me just hide the question, and I think you have access to
Good, I
change
do.
your slides, right?
This is perfect. Wonderful. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present a sketch of a classic argument for the existence of God called the contingency argument. Now, this is a form of argument from cause and effect. A moment ago, I just touched on many things very, very quickly at a blinding pace. And what I want to do is just slow down, get careful in our thinking about this particular classic argument for what I call a supreme foundation. This is my characterization of God as a reality that is absolutely supreme, and I'll say more about what that means as I continue. And I'm going to slow this down and unpack this argument. So first, I like to begin the argument by thinking about a general puzzle. This is a puzzle of existence. This is a question that many people would ask. It's a question that, as a philosopher, I get very curious about, which is why does anything at all exist? Like, why isn't there just nothing? Nothing at all. No universe, no space, just no people, nothing. That would be sort of a simpler reality. And in fact, if I didn't know any better, I would think that that's the most probable theory of reality, that there's just nothing. It's the simplest account. And yet here I am, I exist. And so there's not just nothing. But why is there something? What explains that? And this leads to a puzzle because if you think about it, if something does explain the existence of something rather than nothing, then you can ask about that thing what explains its existence. right? Like, so imagine that somehow this entity here, this Lego, explains existence. Well, then what explains this Lego's existence? This doesn't solve the problem. It only exacerbates the question. How could there even be an explanation of existence? Now, let me unpack why this is a problem in terms of a paradox.
Can I ask you like two questions? Very simple. If you can define, what do you mean by reality and existence? These are very difficult to define in my idea.
Yes, just anything. Anything, these are primitives in a way, but just anything. So anything that exists would include things like your hands, your feet, things like rocks, things like particles, anything that can causally interact with things, anything that can be a product of things. I mean existence in the broadest sense, just anything at all. One sort of criteria for existence would be like anything that has attributes. So if something has some attributes, then it exists. If the attributes have attributes, then those attributes exist. Maybe we could say anything that has attributes or is had by something. So if the attributes have attributes and those attributes have attributes, and you come to sort of an end of that regress, those top level attributes exist because they're had by something. But pretty much it's hard to define because it's kind of a primitive, just anything at all. And did you have another question on that?
Another question was about reality. How would you define reality? But there is
just anything. Yeah. What if nothing cannot exist and therefore there must always be something? Yeah. In fact, I'm going to make the argument that that's exactly right. That is a solution to this puzzle of existence. There can't be nothing. There must be something. And I'm actually going to draw out an argument for that. So that's a wonderful question. But before I get to that argument, I want to just draw out how this mystery can turn into a paradox. And it's because there's a contradiction between two very intuitive principles. There's this principle called the principle of universal explanation, which says this: whatever exists depends on something that explains it, some external explanation. So, for example, these Legos exist, but they don't just exist from nothing. They were caused to exist. I mean, nobody watching this probably thinks that these Legos just appeared from nothing without any explanation. You probably expect a further explanation, even though you never saw the explanation. Well, why is that? Well, you might think in general, anything that exists just by existing has to have some explanation for its existence. But then that contradicts the principle of unexplained existence, which is the principle that reality in its totality, all the things added up, whatever there is, Legos, planets, people, everything all added up across all time and all space, there's nothing external to all that's real, because all that's real includes all that's real. And so reality in total has no external explanation. But then that contradicts the principle that everything has some external explanation. Every portion of reality has some external explanation, but reality in total doesn't. How can that be? How can both of those be true? And this leads to what I call the foundation theory, which provides a solution to this puzzle of existence. And this is going to lead into the person's question about whether the necessary existence, the necessity of there being something, could explain why there's something rather than nothing. In fact, I'm going to go further and I'm going to ask, well, if it's necessary that there's something, why is it necessary that there's something? And I'm going to end up arguing that that's going to be explained in terms of something that has a necessary nature that's foundational to everything else. So according to the foundation theory, reality includes a foundational layer, which is able to exist on its own without any external cause or explanation. This then will help with the paradox of existence, because on this theory, reality in total lacks an external explanation by including a foundation that by nature exists independently. So just to illustrate this, imagine you have this bit of reality that's dependent on this foundational bit of reality. Now, then the whole of reality doesn't depend on anything external, precisely because the whole of reality includes a special kind of reality that can exist on its own. This is the base layer of reality, and then it accounts for all the dependent things. This then solves, at one level, the paradox that we just saw, because it shows that what was wrong with the principle of universal explanation is that it was too broad. The principle of universal explanation says that all of existence, including reality in total, would have some external explanation, but that's impossible. So we restrict the principle to dependent things. Dependent things and dependent totals, dependent parts, and dependent combinations, all those things depend on some external explanation, ultimately then in terms of a foundation that's independent. So there's the picture, the two category picture of reality. You have dependent things, ultimately dependent on a foundation. So you see, I'm slowing this down here so we can think carefully about the paradox and about the solution. So are there any questions so far about this theory, what this
Well, the
is?
first question would be like, is it really necessary existence or necessary foundation, or is just a term or a way of defining it? So we can define, for example, a Lego as necessary existence in its state of existence. Is that make
So
sense?
great. Yes, beautiful. And this actually comes next. I'm going to click to the next slide because we're going to ask what could be foundational. And you're asking whether the foundational thing would itself have necessary existence. And so I'm going to investigate that. This is going to lead to the first part of the argument, which is a reason to think that it would have necessary existence. And so I'm going to unpack what that means. And we'll see if that clarifies your question. So here's the deep question. What could be foundational? I mean, so the foundational theory just says that there's something foundation, some ground layer of reality that explains the rest of reality. But this kind of moves the mystery to the foundation. What kind of reality could be foundational? So here's a question for everybody that I think can help you to unlock insight by your own light. So everybody watching this is coming from your own perspective, your own total experiences. And my whole goal in my presentations is to put some light on the light that you have to investigate this for yourself. So I'm going to give you my own perspective, but ultimately I want you to sort of think about this for yourself and think kind of what makes sense to you. So here's a question for all of you that I think can help you to unlock insight from your own vantage point, which is this. You can ask about fundamental reality. How is it that a fundamental reality could be relevantly different from all other dependent explained things? So, for example, if you think that blue objects, blue Legos, would have a cause, and no matter how many Legos you stack up, there would be some cause of those Legos, some prior reality that causes them, then you can infer that fundamental reality, whatever it is not a blue Lego. Okay. And presumably it's not a red Lego either, right? Because differences in color don't seem to be relevant differences. So if you have that sense that differences in color aren't relevant to be to account for how something could be foundational, then that can give you information about the nature of the foundation. Now I'm going to just unpack that a little bit more by introducing to you then this first part of the argument.
There are two questions if you want to
Yes,
handle them before.
let's do it.
So first one is about meteorological criticism. If you want to say something about the rearrangement of objects and the view that no objects really exist because it's just
Yes.
a rearrangement of other particles.
Yes. So this is a wonderful question. This is going to point to the second stage of the argument, which is identifying the nature of the foundation. So far as the argument goes, it could be that the foundational reality is a kind of material reality that just changes shape and form, and all contingent realities are just different shapes and forms of the foundational reality. Okay. I'm going to just invite you to hold on to that question because we're going to come back to that when we look more closely at the identification stage of the argument. I think some of these questions, maybe if I can get farther along in the presentation, these questions will then kind of point to those parts of the presentation.
Okay, I will show you the next one. Maybe it's more related, and
Okay.
then we'll let this wait for a bit.
Sure. Is it necessary existence because that's the only logical path, or is it just a property of a thing which necessarily exists? So the way I'm thinking of necessary existence is that it within its own nature, there's no possibility of its non-existence. So for example, by contrast, these Legos could be smashed and destroyed, so the Legos don't exist. If something has necessary existence, then it's a matter of what they sometimes say metaphysical necessity, that it's within reality. An example of this, you might think of the laws of logic as having a kind of necessary reality to them or necessary existence. For example, that nothing can be both square and not square at the same time. That very principle, you might think, has a kind of necessary truth that corresponds with a necessary existence, a necessary logical reality. Now, so far in the argument, I'm not assuming that there is a necessary reality. I'm going to give an argument for that. But just to clarify what this is just something, you could think of it as a property that a thing has. It has this property of necessary existence. It is such that it cannot not be, is a good way of putting it.
Okay, now you can continue, and we'll take more questions when you want. Just tell me.
That sounds great. So we can think of the argument from cause and effect, the general argument called the cosmological argument, as a tool for investigating the nature of fundamental reality. This argument comes in two stages. I'm borrowing this terminology from William Rowe in his book on the cosmological argument, where he divides the argument into two stages. The first stage seeks to identify the existence of a foundation, and the second stage seeks to identify the nature of that foundation. So we see that in stage one, there's an argument. I've divided the argument into two steps. The first step has some kind of dependence principle or causal principle. For example, we'll say in general that anything of type T, contingent, beginning, finite, will be dependent on something else, some explanation, some cause, some ground, or some condition. And then there's a linking step that links the dependence principle to a foundation of T things. And there's different versions of this linking step. I'll illustrate this in the next slide when I give an argument from contingency. But step two links step one to the conclusion that there's some foundation. Then we move on to the identification stage, which I've divided that into two steps. So step three of the total argument would be analyzing the attributes. So for some reasons, Q, whatever these might be, a foundation of T things would have attributes in set A. So I'm saying this in a very general way. I'm not yet specifying those reasons. This is just the outline. And then we can think about the concept of what you mean by God to deduce that if the foundation of things have attributes in set A, then that foundation will qualify as a supreme being or as God. And so this is a general structure of cosmological arguments, and then different arguments fill the structure in different ways. So there's a Kalam cosmological argument that fills this in terms of explaining beginnings of existence and identifying the nature of the cause of the beginning of the universe. The argument from contingency, which I'm going to focus in on here, focuses on explaining contingent things and then identifying the nature of the foundation of contingent things. So here, let me then fill in the argument from contingency. So an argument from contingency stage one has as its first step this dependence principle. Here's one way of putting the principle. Whatever is wholly contingent, that is, it consists only of things that could possibly be absent from reality or things that could possibly not exist, things that don't have to of necessity exist. Those kinds of things depend on a prior condition. Two general reasons in support of this principle. One is just universal experience through science. So science uncovers a causal order where things come from other things. And so this principle predicts this causal order, that the things that come from other things are contingent things, and those contingent things depend on prior conditions. A second kind of reason for this is illustrated by philosopher Richard Taylor, where he tells a story of some people go into a forest and they find a sphere and they wonder, how did that sphere get there? Well, they don't have any experience with that particular kind of reality. But if that's a contingent reality, it doesn't exist of necessity, then the very fact that it exists rather than not seems to call for an explanation. The people, seriously, like if you went into a forest, you found a big blue sphere, you probably wouldn't think that that blue sphere just exists without any prior condition or explanation. You'd probably expect that has some explanation. Maybe some government created this, or maybe some people put this together. You may have no idea what the explanation is, but you'd expect that it has some explanation. And this points to a general principle of explanation of contingent things, that we expect contingent things, just by their very nature being contingent, to have a further explanation. So that's a kind of second support for this first step. And we can come back to possible questions or objections to this principle in the Q&A. But let me just continue so I can complete the argument. So step 2 is the linking step. The next premise is that there's nothing prior to reality in total. That's because reality in total includes everything. So there's nothing prior to everything. This includes everything across all time and all space. So it includes whatever there is. So by definition, there's nothing beyond all of it. Therefore, it follows from the first step that reality in total is not wholly contingent, because whatever's wholly contingent depends on a prior condition. There's no prior condition of all of reality. So reality in total then can't be completely contingent. And so it follows that there must be something that's not contingent, which is what I mean by necessary. Contingent is that which can fail to be, and necessary is that which cannot fail to be, that which must be. So then it follows that there is some necessary foundation, some prior condition of whatever contingent things there are. So this is a way of showing how that foundation theory not only makes sense of the puzzle of existence, explains how there can be anything at all, solves that puzzle, but also can give us a deep explanation of contingent things, which fits with our experience with the causal order. So that's the first stage of an argument from contingency, which then leads us back to the question, okay, well, what is the nature of this necessary foundation? If there is a necessary foundation, we can still ask about its nature. Going back to the previous question about matter, could matter itself be a necessary foundation that just changes form and shape? So I offer this question as a question for unlocking insight. How is the foundation of reality relevantly different from all other dependent explained things? And the argument from contingency identifies at least one attribute that seems to be a relevant difference, namely necessary existence. That seems to be relevant because it seems like if something is not necessarily existent, then there's a special reason to expect some explanation of its existence. Why does it exist rather than not? This doesn't have necessary existence, so why does it exist rather than not? If it has necessary existence, then that removes that particular call for an explanation of its contingent existence. Do you have any questions at this stage? I've covered a lot of ground here.
There is a question about the principle of causality, which I will put up.
Wonderful. If the principle of causality applies to all reality, then what created reality? If there's no causality for the whole, how can it be a cause for parts of it? Is the whole not caused by its parts? Okay, there's a few different questions. So first, I want to make sure it's very clear at this stage that the principle of causality here applies only to contingent reality. So it's not going to apply to all reality. In fact, the whole paradox of existence was about the problem with trying to cause all of reality. There can't be a cause of all of reality because at least there can't be an external cause of all of reality because there's nothing external to all of reality. So I just want to make sure it's very clear that at this stage, we're now focusing in on contingent reality, and we're saying that there's got to be some kind of cause of contingent reality. And then in order to avoid circularity, that cause has to not itself be contingent, but be necessary. Now, the second question here is about the relationship between parts and wholes. And here, I've thought so much about this, and I've thought really it's helpful just to leave things as open as you can leave them. So there's different theories about how the parts and the wholes could relate. One idea is that there could be a whole of reality that's prior to the parts, that in a way the whole explains the parts. Now, in that theory, then, according to the foundation theory, the whole would have necessary existence, and then the parts could have contingent existence. So you still have the two category theory of reality. You have the necessary existent whole, and then the contingent parts. That's completely consistent with everything that I've said so far with this argument. Now, going the other way, the person asking this question might be wondering, okay, what if it goes the other way? What if it's the parts that are prior to the whole? It's the parts that explain the whole. That's also completely consistent with the argument, because then we can still ask about the contingent parts. What explains their existence? What explains the contingent parts in total? So think, and I want to just draw this out a little bit. So let's think about these Lego pieces. we could ask what explains the whole combination, and maybe the whole combination of this plus this is explained somehow just by these individual parts, okay? But then we can ask about the parts, the plural of the parts. What explains them? And according to the causal principle, the explanation of the parts can't be in terms of those same parts because that would be circular. And that's true even if there's infinitely many parts. Even if there's infinitely many parts, to explain the parts in terms of those same parts leads to a kind of circularity that's contrary to our experience of the causal order. To draw this out just a little bit further, because I think this is just so important to get clear on this, if instead we allow plurals of contingent parts to exist without any cause or any explanation, then there's this deep mystery about why this never happens. You never have infinite piles of turtles, all causally connected to each other, appearing, the entire pile, all the parts together, appearing without any cause or explanation. If we have a circular explanation, that doesn't help at all, because again, then you would have that same problem of how the infinite stack of turtles could, by circular explanation, explain why it exists rather than not. But we don't have anything like that. In every case of contingent things, whether finite or infinite, there's always going to be some prior cause to explain them. And there's no exception to this basic principle in all of our experience. So my main thing, I know I've spent a bit of time on this question, but my main point here is that this argument leaves wide open the relationship between the parts and the wholes. Whether the parts depend on the whole or the whole depends on the parts, still, according to this argument, there's going to be an explanation of the contingent portions of reality in terms of something that's not itself contingent, some necessary foundation. So I hope that helps. I hope that makes sense. And I also don't want to suggest that these aren't deep waters or even controversial waters, but I think it can just be very helpful to sort the different concepts and make these distinctions even before entering into arguments. I think sometimes people run into the arguments so quickly that these distinctions aren't made. And that's something that I want to be careful to make these distinctions. Of course, in this presentation, I can't make all the distinctions right away. So there's sort of a mix of giving the argument, inviting the distinctions. I think that helps us to understand the argument in better light.
Do you think it's right to ask the question about how it's called, quantum mechanics and the causality there, since we speak about the principle of causality? Some people say, okay, quantum mechanics, just there's no causality and it's some illogical stuff happening there. What is your view on that?
So you can have non-deterministic causation. So in quantum mechanics, the Copenhagen interpretation, my understanding is that the causation is probabilistic. It's not deterministic. And that's completely consistent with this principle that says that contingent reality depends on a prior condition. That leaves open whether the prior condition involves a deterministic cause or a probabilistic cause. So even in quantum mechanics, when they talk about virtual particles coming into being, they're not saying that it comes into being literally without a prior state. In fact, I've been reading a lot about the foundations of physics in relation to my work on consciousness. And the latest theory, according to the quantum field theorists, is that the particles themselves are based on states of a more basic fundamental field. And that's exactly what this argument is pointing to, that there's some prior condition that allows the other things to exist. And again, that leaves open whether the connection between the foundation and its effects is probabilistic or deterministic. So that's completely consistent with our latest science.
Is there something illogical in that, or in what is happening in the quantum mechanics, or how do you see?
Yeah, so I think what it is we have to distinguish between a mystery where we don't understand like how something works versus a contradiction where we actually do understand that it couldn't work. Okay, so there are mysteries in quantum mechanics in the sense that maybe we're not understanding how certain things go together. But I don't believe that there's anything in quantum mechanics that reveals a contradiction. And certainly not with respect to the argument that I'm giving. I think it all fits very well. And specifically with respect to indeterministic causation or indeterministic relations between things, that's not only perfectly logical, I would argue that we actually witness that kind of causation in our own decision making. So if I make a decision, I can decide to like move my hand this way. And if it's a decision between different options, then it's not a deterministic decision, but it's a decision I'm making within a range of different options. So that's not only logical, but I think also fits very well with our actual experience of the causal order.
So there is a last question if you want to take,
Sure.
and then we can move on, I think.
Sounds great.
It's follow-up question.
Does the necessary blob of everything have necessary have necessity components? How can a necessary group contain a necessary subgroup? So I want to leave open. So first, just a distinction. We can talk about a blob of all things, and then we can talk about whether within the blob of all things, there's a special kind of thing that has necessary existence. So going back to the diagram, I always feel like the pictures sort of help here. This is a diagram representation. Let's say that this is let's say that the total is the blob of everything, and then this foundation is a necessary blob of all necessary things. And so now the question is, within the necessary blob of necessary things, can there be subgroups within? How can a necessary group contain a necessary subgroup? And here I actually just want to leave that completely open. It could be, as far as the argument goes so far, that this necessary reality has necessary parts. One way you might think of this is in terms of numbers. So some philosophers think that numbers have a necessary existence. So numbers 1 and 2 and 3, 4, all the way up, all the way to infinity. Those numbers all existed even before we discovered them, and they're part of the necessary reality. And I actually want to leave that as an open option. So when you're thinking about the necessary foundation, just include within the necessary foundation all the things that you think have necessary existence, whether it be numbers, mathematical propositions, whether it be some kind of matter, anything that you think would have necessary existence, just include that in there and then call that the necessary total. And then we're going to look in the next part at the identification stage. What else can we say about this necessary total? So that's coming up next.
Cool, thanks. Can go,
Yes.
I think.
Okay, so can we say more? So let's let N refer to the total of the necessary foundation, whatever that is. So if this is necessary foundation, just let N refer to that, the totality of it, whatever that is. Contingent effects are beyond and outside of N. And now we can try to understand what's the nature of N. I would say there's two general strategies for investigating the nature of the foundation. One is to look at the effects of consciousness, sense of right and wrong, complexity, design. I talked about this earlier. And you can try to see if you can infer some properties of the cause from the properties of the effects. So you might think that the cause would have the resources to produce consciousness, to produce a finely tuned environment, to produce beings that can have a moral sense. A different approach is, instead of looking at the effects, you look at the nature of the cause and you just analyze it with reason to see, okay, what kind of foundation could have necessary existence and an independent nature? Because it's not just that this is necessary, it's also independent, doesn't depend on anything else. It's the ultimate. It's the foundation of everything else. There can be nothing beyond the total of the necessary and the contingent. The necessary and the contingent exhausts all possible categories of reality. So the total of the necessary reality, which I'm calling N, is the ultimate foundation. There's nothing beyond that. It's completely independent. So I'm going to take that second approach. I'm going to apply reason. I'm going to apply reason to think about the nature of the foundation. And I have this little argument here. I call it the turtle argument. The turtle argument helps us to identify a structure of reasoning that we can use when thinking about the foundation. So here's the argument. Turtles, in our experience, are contingent and dependent. Now, let me just clarify, these arguments don't have to be 100% proofs. They can be built on just reasons that are plausible given your total experiences. And what's plausible to you may not be plausible to somebody else because you have different experiences than other people. So I just invite you to consider from your own experience whether turtles, from your own experience, are plausibly contingent and dependent things. So when I think about this, it seems to me that differences between turtles are not relevant to a difference with respect to contingent existence or dependent existence. And so this is a reason that I have to think that turtles are contingent and dependent. But n by definition is necessary and independent. Therefore, n in its total nature can't actually be a turtle. That's not the nature of n. The fundamental reality isn't a turtle because turtles depend on something prior, and fundamental reality doesn't depend on anything prior. So now, using this turtle argument, we can think about that general reasoning, and I offer a formula for uncovering n's nature. So take any attribute A, whether it's being a turtle, being blue, being a square, and ask yourself whether you, from your own light, from your own total experience, have some reason to think that A is relevantly different from other attributes that are contingent or dependent. So you can think about this for yourself. Like when I think about it, I think about the attribute being blue, and I think, well, it seems like differences in color are just irrelevant to being able to be dependent. It seems like if any color depends on some causes, then all colors alike depend on causes. If any shape depends on causes, then all shapes alike depend on causes. Because otherwise, it seems to me to be completely arbitrary why this necessary reality, this foundation, would have that color. Why blue? Or would have that shape? Why square rather than a different color or a different shape? So when I ask myself this question with respect to these attributes here, being a turtle, being blue, being square, it seems to me clear from both reason and experience that these are not relevantly different from dependent contingent attributes. Now you might think, okay, well, that maybe seems obvious enough, but this has significant results because now you can think about the nature of n. N has necessary existence. It has independent existence. So now you can think about those attributes. You can say, okay, well, look, if I don't have any reason to think that they're different from the others, then I have some reason to treat them like the rest. So attribute A is contingent or it's dependent. And if A is contingent or dependent, then A can't be included in n's fundamental nature, which is n's nature that doesn't depend on any prior causes. So n is the foundation, so nothing's prior to n, and then the nature of n then can't depend on anything beyond n itself. So anything that is dependent on other prior causes can't be included in n's fundamental nature. So Vasile, this honestly is exactly why I've come to think that n cannot be fundamentally blue. In fact, this is one of the things that actually seems clear to me. It seems clear to me from both reason and experience that n's fundamental nature is not blue. Because if it were blue, then I would think it would have to have some further cause or explanation. But n's fundamental nature has no further cause or explanation, so n's fundamental nature can't be blue. And for that same reason, any other color or any other shape. This actually fits very well with the latest physics. I've been reading about quantum field theory, where even the very foundation of matter itself, according to the latest theory, it transcends space and shape and structure. Some physicists are even saying it has a kind of informational aspect. I would say even information is not itself going to be fundamental. Information comes from minds. And so I'm going to look deeper into, okay, what's the foundation of matter itself? And this leads to the final part of the argument here. And again, this is just a sketch, an introduction to the two parts of the argument. So we had part one, an argument for a foundation of contingent things. That's my example here. We have a foundation of contingent things. And then part two seeks to identify the nature of this foundation. And so here's an outline of an argument for why you might think this foundation, the deepest nature of the foundation, the foundational nature of the foundation itself, would not be blue, would not be square, would not be a shape, but would instead have necessary existence and supreme existence. So here's the argument. The foundation is necessary and independent. Anything that's less than supreme would be contingent or dependent. So only a supreme foundation whose fundamental nature lacks finite boundaries or imperfections that call for further explanation would be both necessary and independent. And if all that's right, then it would follow that the foundation of reality has this supreme nature. It has a nature that doesn't build in finite boundaries or imperfections. It doesn't build in a limited amount of power to produce things. Instead, the foundation of the foundation is purely supreme. And then this goes back to that question: what would be a relevant difference between the foundational unexplained realities and the dependent realities that have a further explanation? Here's an answer to that. Here's a key that can maybe unlock greater insight into the foundation. The foundation has a supreme nature, and being supreme is a relevant difference between the explained and the unexplained. Because if you think about it, just think about this with me. If something is not supreme, it has some particular shape or boundary, it looks like a turtle, well, then we don't have some identifiable relevant difference that accounts for how it could be unexplained. Whereas if it is supreme, then in virtue of its supreme nature, it would be able to exist in an independent way. It's the kind of thing that would have robust, necessary, independent existence, and would then predict that would have the kinds of resources that could result in a reality with all the dimensions that we see. It would have the resources for producing beings like us. It would have a supreme power, including cognitive powers, to shape a reality that results in beings that can reason and reflect. It would have a supreme moral nature, because if it didn't have a supreme moral nature, then there would be some kind of limit with respect to its total quality. We could imagine a greater or more supreme foundation. A perfectly, purely supreme foundation then would provide the deepest possible kind of explanation of everything else. So that's basically the sketch. Yes,
yeah.
That's it.
I have a question about the foundation. How do you imagine it? Do you think it is inside the time space itself, the foundation itself, or it is outside, or beyond the time space?
My view is that it transcends space. This seems to fit the contemporary physical theory, even of the nature of matter, that the foundations of matter itself transcend space, and space grows out of the powers of the foundation. As far as whether it transcends time, it's going to depend, I think, on what you mean by time here, because I understand that there is this theory of space-time where time is a kind of dimension of space. And if time is a kind of dimension of space, then I would say, yes, it transcends space-time for the same reason it transcends space. It would have to, because any spatial and temporal boundaries encode these kind of limits that would detract from that supreme nature. So in order for it to have that perfectly supreme nature, that nature itself can't be in terms of space-time. However, if we think of time more broadly as something in which change occurs, then I think that because the foundation exists presently with us in a changing world, my own view is that it exists in time in this broad sense, because it exists with us in a changing world.
Okay, thank you. We have some other questions. First one about turtles.
Sounds great. Turtles are contingent to theory of evolution. Is evolution a contingent reason? Evolution attributes are quite cruel. Is necessary existence also cruel? Okay, again, there's a few questions here to separate out. So I want to leave open, as I said before, sort of how the foundation creates the rest of reality, how the rest of reality unfolds. I'm going to leave that open. My own view from my own work on complex adaptive systems, these are systems in which there are self-replicators. So a few years ago, I was part of a research group where I actually created a computer program to simulate complex adaptive systems. And I was exploring sort of what happens if I design certain targets, certain environments where the self-replicators could then evolve towards those targets. And what happens if I don't design the targets? I just leave it up to chance. And what I found from my experiments, I wrote the program and I ran it, and I could witness the evolution of the creatures, the little self-replicators on my screen. And what I found is that when I did not design any targets, that there was no interesting evolution. But whereas if I instead designed the targets by fine-tuning the environment so it would select certain things, in the direction that I wanted them to evolve, then I could have an evolution that would lead to some very interesting results. So this is a reason that one of many reasons that I have for thinking that the best ultimate explanation of the evolution of creatures is going to be in terms of some kind of design plan of the universe itself. Now, in terms of the cruelty of the nature of evolution and the unfolding of things, I actually think that it's good for reality to have certain degrees of indeterminacy and risk, because this leads to certain kinds of experiences where we can learn how to love each other. We can learn how to have courage, how we can build relationships. And I actually would extend this all the way out to all the creatures, that all the creatures are part of a great soul building adventure. And I would expect that if the foundation is perfectly supreme and perfectly good, that reality would unfold in a way that would lead to very interesting kinds of adventures. This is something that I would expect. Now, this doesn't solve every question that one could ask about animal suffering and why it occurs. My own view is that every suffering is itself a departure from the original design plan. It's not actually part of the original design plan that beings suffer, but that there are reasons why departures from that original design plan are possible, in part because of free will, in part because of the value of risk, in part because of just constraints on natural laws in order to have a certain kind of environment. And so, yeah, there's a lot there. There's a lot of different topics there, but kind of my simple summary is just that the Supreme Foundation allows a wide range of options for how reality could then unfold from there that's consistent with its perfect goodness.
Okay. Do you still need the slides, or do you think I can close this and
You
we
can
can
close
go?
those down, sure.
Okay.
Yep.
So, okay, thanks for this answer. I have another question. I think you consider the foundation to be perfect, as you said, supreme being.
Yes.
How can it create imperfect beings like human beings? And how do you think? How do you answer
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. So I actually think that if it couldn't create imperfect beings or limited beings, then it would actually not be supreme. It would be missing a certain kind of power to create a certain kind of value. So I think there's a value in there being a diversity of beings leading to a diversity of relationships. So, for example, my wife and I, we have kids, and there's something very special about the relationships that we have with our kids. And part of what makes the relationship special is that our kids are different than we are. There's distinctions between us and our children. Another thing that makes it special is that there's opportunities for growth. So my children, they all start very small and then they grow. They start extremely limited and then they experience growth through this sort of process of expansion. And there's something actually very beautiful. I've been thinking a lot about this recently. There's something very meaningful about the kinds of relationships, the kinds of experiences that can form out of connection with a variety of beings that are growing from states of limitation. But those experiences are impossible if the perfect foundation doesn't create a variety of beings, doesn't allow beings to enter into states of limitation, doesn't create a world in which there can be, I guess I'll just say it again, a diversity of beings leading to a diversity of experiences. So I would actually argue in the other direction that in order for it to be perfect, it would have to have the power to actualize this wide range of valuable experiences.
And do you think this foundation can create something like itself, another foundation? Would that be possible?
I don't
Like,
think it can create a foundation that's uncreated, because I think that would be a contradiction. Um, could it create, maybe what you're asking is, could it create another being that is perfect? Is that the idea?
yeah, but actually, to be perfect, maybe is to be uncreated, so it doesn't
Right,
make sense.
right. So maybe the question would be, could it create a being that's perfect in every other respect?
Yeah,
Has
something
perfect
like that.
knowledge, perfect goodness, but is not uncreated. I kind of want to leave that open. I mean, you could think that perhaps some models of God sort of build that in. For example, a Trinitarian model of God, you might think one version of it is that from the source consciousness, which we might call the Father, emerges the Son. This is part of a certain theology that the Son is eternally generated or dependent on the Father. And then from the Father and the Son come the Spirit. or from just the sun comes from comes the spirit, depending on your theology. So I think there are some options there, and I kind of want to leave that open as far as the argument from contingency goes.
Okay, so here's another question.
The most elementary particles of matter and energy, since neither matter nor energy can be created or destroyed, and they can only change form. This is wonderful. So this brings back that question again. Now, I'm going to say an answer that may be surprising, and then I want to qualify this. So the answer that I want to say that may be surprising is yes. Okay. But I want to qualify this and just say it's going to depend on the theory of the most fundamental elementary particles. So according to the latest physics that I've been reading, the quantum field theory, the particles aren't actually the most fundamental reality. It's a quantum field, and the particles are states or ripples in the quantum field. Well, what is the nature of the quantum field? Okay. Well, scientists are pointing to some things. I mean, the quantum field at least has the resources for making the particles. It at least has the resources for generating the visible universe that we see. So it has at least those things. But there are some things about the quantum field that the empirical science is leaving open. So here's a question just to think about and really just to ponder this. Could the quantum field be itself a name or description of a perfect foundation, where the perfect foundation itself is the substance out of which all other things are made? Is that a possibility? Now, at this point, maybe you're not going to want to call the perfect foundation particles. Well, as I already said, I think the particles are grounded in something more fundamental, like the quantum field. So then you could ask, well, what about the quantum field? Could it be created or destroyed? Well, let's say it can't. Let's say the quantum field can't be created or destroyed. Then I want to ask, what's the fundamental nature of that quantum field? And I want to kind of take a two-path approach. So one path is going to say that, well, either the foundational nature of that quantum field is purely perfect, okay, or it's not. If it is purely perfect, or supreme is the word that I use, then that will fit with the identification stage of the argument. Because if it's less than supreme, then it has these arbitrary boundaries and features that I think call for further explanation. I mean, I think this is actually one of the reasons to think that elementary particles call for deeper explanation, because you can ask about their particular properties and features, even their number, why those properties, why those features, why that number, and we have a deeper explanation in terms of a quantum field. So if the basic nature of the quantum field itself doesn't have arbitrary limits or boundaries, it's a perfect nature, well, then that's fine. Then call it God, call it quantum field. It's just two names for a fundamentally supreme reality. That's just a matter of vocabulary. I think actually this is a kind of a helpful point, because I think people sometimes come to these questions from different conceptual frameworks, and sometimes they're actually looking at the same thing in substance, but they call them very different. They have different concepts, so they don't realize how close they are. If, on the other hand, the foundational of the quantum field can't be characterized in terms of perfect nature, well, then that's going to be my reason to think that it's not truly foundational, that actually it's grounded in something deeper, precisely because, according to my argument, the deepest thing would have to be supreme. The only other thing I want to note here is that the supreme foundation theory leaves open the length of time that things exist. So it could even be that this supreme foundation has existed eternally, and that maybe even particles, I mean, you could make the argument that particles could exist eternally. I think this is contrary to our latest and best science of the origin of the universe, the origin of the particles in terms of the Big Bang. But for the sake of argument, we could leave that open, and we could say, well, maybe the elementary particles have always been there, even if they themselves are grounded in this quantum field, which itself is grounded in this perfect mind or perfect nature. So I hope that helps. There's a lot there.
Thanks. I think it's good. We have a similar question what I asked, if a foundation can create itself. So basically it's quite the same. So
yeah, I don't think it can create itself because it's uncreated. There might be a way in which it could explain itself depending on your understanding of explanation. You might think that in some sense it exists because of its supreme nature. It's the kind of thing that must exist and therefore does exist. But ultimately it's not going to be created.
Another question we have, do you think we are in the best possible world? So this is Leibnizian, I think, the problem of Leibniz.
I think this is a difficult question for me because if we think of the possible world in terms of all time, so it includes the entire future. So I think that I think the foundation of reality is good, and that all things are working themselves together for the good. And at every moment, God is seeking the best possible outcome consistent with what came before. So God is always working things for the best. But I also think that there's real indeterminacy in the world. There's ways in which things can depart from what's best in the moment. But all those departures can also then be used for something that's the best. Or I'm sorry, for something that's better. But it might be that for every state of reality, there's always a better state of reality. So there's no sort of best possible state of reality. If you think of time inclusive, the whole show all the way out, is that the best possible? And there, I think that I would want to say modestly that I wouldn't say that it's the best possible, but that it's sort of based on the best kind of realities, based on the best kind of foundation. The reason why this is a complex question for me is because I do think that for every state of reality, there's always a better possible state toward the future. And it's hard for me to think about the total reality all at once. That's a hard one for me to think about. So I'm not quite sure, to be honest. But certainly nothing in my argument requires it.
Okay, this is another one.
How does time work in the dimension of this foundation? Great question. Because if it always existed, then time goes back forever in that dimension, which leads to a paradox. So again, here we can leave open our understanding of the nature of the foundation's relation to time. There are two basic schools of thought. One school of thought says that the foundation exists timelessly, so it transcends time. Another school of thought is that it exists in time, and time is infinite. Now, if we think of it as existing in time and time is infinite, I'd have to hear more about specifically which paradox you're thinking about here. I mean, there are varieties of arguments against infinite regress.
Yeah, I
in
think
time.
I think he's thinking about infinite regress.
Yeah. So yeah, if you're convinced that those infinite regress arguments are sound, then that's going to be a reason to think that it doesn't exist across an infinite amount of time, but instead that actually prior to creation, at least, it exists timelessly. That's my view, is that without creation, it's timeless, and then with creation, it actually enters into time.
Okay, now I will ask you some general questions, maybe like this one, since you wrote a book about the truth.
Yeah, wonderful.
So, what is truth? Can we as subjects determine the objective truth?
So my view is that truth is a correspondence with reality. So I have the thought that this Lego exists. That thought is in my mind. The Lego is presumably external to my mind in some sense. I'm acquainted with some of its features within my mind, but this Lego doesn't seem to depend on my mind. Assume that's true. Still, the thought that the Lego exists is true if it corresponds with this Lego. And so then that's what objective truth is. Can we as subjects determine the objective truth? Now, it's difficult here because that term objective, what does that mean? One way of thinking of objective is that it doesn't depend on a subject. Well, this is a little bit tricky, because if fundamental reality is a fundamental mind, then you could say the fundamental reality is itself a subject. And the fundamental reality is itself a subject, then everything depends on a subject. So everything's subjective in that sense, okay? But there's another sense of being subjective where the actual truth consists in its relation to subjective states of consciousness. And I don't think that you have to think that. So I could think, for example, that this Lego exists, and that's true, not because it consists in a relation to a subjective state of consciousness, but because it consists in a relation to the Lego, the actual Lego, which doesn't depend on my own consciousness.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I usually think about, for example, the foundation as having parts or characteristics, which, for example, if I'm a subject, I have a mind.
Yes.
The fact that I have two hands, this is still objective for everyone.
Yes.
Even if I'm a subject, the fact that I have two hands is objective for everyone. Can be the
Yes.
same for a foundation, which characteristics like morality can be objective, like an object for everyone,
Absolutely.
even if it's the subject.
Yes, I love that's a great I love how you put that. It's a great way of putting it. Yes, the foundation can be a subject, even if its subjective reality is for everybody. Like I'm a subject, and it's true for everybody that I'm a subject, right?
Yeah,
Yes,
right.
yes.
Cool. Okay, the next question, the same general one, is about the free will. I'm curious about your view.
I do think that we have libertarian free will. I used to teach courses on free will, and we would take some time unpacking the different components. So the libertarian account of free will would have two parts. One is that I'm the source of my actions, so the source condition, and then also that my actions are not determined. So I could have done otherwise. And I do think that that is correct. I think we do have those conditions. One thing that's a lot of people don't consider is whether it could be true that we have libertarian free will and compatibilism is also true. That is to say that free will is compatible with determinism. And it's interesting because I do think there are certain notions of free will that maybe are compatible with certain notions of determinism, even though, as a matter of fact, we also have libertarian free will, if that makes sense. So I do think we could do otherwise, and we're the source of our actions.
Okay, one question back for the timelessness. I think it's important.
Yes.
If the foundation exists timelessly, that means it exists for 0 seconds. Since 0 is the only non-quantification of time, so if it exists for 0 seconds, does it really exist?
Oh,
Or
yes. So if it exists timelessly, then it wouldn't exist for 0 seconds, um, for the
maybe
very reason that the person gives. So what you're pointing to here is that 0 is a quantity of time. It's like it's a 0 quantity. Whereas the way I would put it is that it doesn't have any quantity of time, not even 0. It's not that it exists for 0 seconds. It's that it doesn't exist for any seconds, not even 0. Does that make sense?
for me it makes sense, but I think we would say, okay, that means it doesn't exist at all. But do you think existence should depend on time, or how do you see it?
I'm not saying that. Okay, so again, it's going to depend on your view of time, right? So I think of time as a product of change. So where there's change, there's time. So that's how I think about it. So when I'm thinking of something that's timeless, I'm just thinking of it being in a world without any creation, without any change. But that's not our world. So in our world, there is change. And so since I think that, in my view, everything is related to changing things, everything is, in some sense, in time.
Okay, but this is the view of how it's called metric time, no? Metric time, and there is another time which Boetius, I think he came and says
Yes.
that eternal now.
Yes.
I kind of like that idea. I don't know if it's true or how.
Yeah, I have certain sympathies there. Especially, well, so how I sort of, this is also going to depend on your view about persistence through time. So I don't know how much to go into. I'll just point to it briefly.
Yeah.
There's two broad ideas. There's the idea that you perdure through time. There's the idea that you endure through time. This is about how you exist from moment to moment. According to the perdurantist theory, you persist through time by having different sort of like temporal parts. So I have like different parts at different times. Whereas enduring through time means that I'm wholly present at every time. So I don't have different temporal parts. Rather, all of me is present at every time. And so that kind of maybe avoids some of the metric analysis there, because it's not that I'm scattered across different segments of time. It's that I'm wholly, completely present at every time. And my view, okay, and this isn't required for the argument or anything, but my current view is that the endurantist model is right, and that the foundation of reality is enduring with us as the foundation of change. And so it is actually wholly present at every moment of time. So it's not scattered across metrics or segments of time. And then this just leads to the question, okay, well, what about the first moment of time, if there is a first moment? And my view there is that if there is a first moment, that first moment consists of, this is my analysis, consists of a transition from a state that itself is just the necessary state of reality, the foundational state, into a changing, created temporal order. And so in that way, time isn't the fundamental reality. Time flows out of change. It's because there's change that therefore there's time. And there's change because of the libertarian decision, let's say, of the foundation to create the world. So by the foundation deciding to create the world, that explains why now there's time and there's change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, time is always a difficult question, and
Yeah,
as Aristotle said, that time is one of the difficult to understand thing among the most difficult things, or something like that.
absolutely. Yes.
So there's another question about. I think this is most about ontological argument,
Yes.
basically. Is modal fatalism true? Maybe if you can explain shortly
Yes.
what that means for the audience.
Yeah. So the idea is there's this worry that maybe everything is necessary, especially if you think the foundation is necessary, and then everything comes from the foundation, just sort of springs forth from the foundation, and then everything's just completely necessary. That's what modal fatalism would be pointing to. And I don't think that that's true. So as I mentioned before, I think there's real indeterminacy in the world. In fact, I think this, when I say indeterminacy, I mean there's real options, there's real pathways, alternative pathways. And that what actually happens is that the foundational reality chooses a particular reality that's good among a set of possible good realities. This is also related to that earlier question about whether we're in the best possible world. I didn't mention that it might be that there's ties for the best possible. So there's not like a single best possible world. And so it might be that there's a range of options that are all within the best. And then the foundational reality just selects one among the options. And so then that would allow there to be real contingency, real alternatives. And then it wouldn't be modal fatalism.
Does it mean that we cannot destroy anything basically because it's necessary, something like that?
It's
Because, for example, I can think at drawing a circle on the sand and then just erasing it. It's not anymore a circle, so it's not necessarily to remain a circle. I
yeah,
can
yeah.
destroy it.
I think that's right. My only hesitation is just that it's stronger than that you can't destroy it. The necessity implies the modalism is that it's necessary, meaning that it exists in every possible world. It's not just that it can't be created or destroyed, it's that it can't be created or destroyed, and it spans all the possible worlds.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's go to another questions here. This is very interesting. I really would like to hear your opinion on this.
Okay, well, and now it depends on what you mean by soul. And so I stay away from that word because people define it differently. I try to stay away from words that are hard for people to define until I've built up enough terms and examples that then I can define those terms in terms of them. So in my book on consciousness, I make an argument first that consciousness is real. Okay. Now, this might seem basic and obvious, but it's very important to understand how you can see that consciousness is real. So by consciousness, I mean some kind of experience. So I have an experience of enjoying this time with you. I have an experience of having certain thoughts. Now, why do I think that's real? It's not by looking at brains. I don't look at brains and see neurons firing and chemicals reacting and come to know that there are experiences. That's just not how I do it. The way that I come to see that consciousness is real is by what philosophers call direct acquaintance through introspection. So I introspect, I look within, and I notice thoughts and feelings. I take myself to be directly acquainted with those aspects of consciousness. That's why I think that those are real. This is a very fundamental step, but it's so important because I think people skip past this and it leads them into a kind of materialism where all that's real is mindless bits of matter and combinations of mindless bits of matter. Well, the second step that I would make in arguing, and I hesitate to use the word soul, but let me just say a being that has consciousness that's not reduced to material forms. Let's say we define a soul that way, as a being that has consciousness that's not reduced to material forms. My second step in making this argument, and this is just a sketch, is from what's called the hard problem of consciousness, as well as a different problem, the combination problem. The hard problem is about explaining how you can get consciousness from mindless bits of matter. That's a deep problem. But there's this other combination problem, which is how you can combine things that are not conscious to form something that is itself conscious. And I actually think that it's possible to be certain that these Legos, if these Legos aren't conscious, there's no combination of these Legos that will form a conscious being. And I think that you can actually gain clarity about this by understanding that mere changes in shape and size and orientation of these Legos is irrelevant to account for how those things themselves would be conscious. I think if you think about it, you can actually come to see that. There's good empirical evidence for this as well. So in Sketch, my argument would be that if consciousness is real and there's no way of rearranging unconscious, mindless things to solve that combination problem or the hard problem, then it's going to follow that some consciousness is fundamental. It's in a sense, the explanation of material changes, like the material changes in my hand right now. It's coming out of my own consciousness. So that would be a sketch of an argument that consciousness is real. It's not explained purely in terms of mindless matter. Therefore, my consciousness is instead explained in terms of something that you might call a soul, or I prefer to say a subject or a substance, a conscious substance. Yes.
Do you think intentionality is also a good argument for this consciousness? Like the fact that we are about something, we think about other things, which is not possible for objects or material.
Absolutely. In my chapter, I have a chapter on thoughts, and I draw out this point that you're making, which is that the aboutness of a thought. I can think about snow. I can think about sheep. I can think about images in my own mind. Okay. Well, what is this aboutness? And I draw out a reason to think that aboutness is not analyzable in terms of fundamental physics. In fact, it's interesting. Many philosophers who don't believe in souls have come to agree with this. Alexander Rosenberg, a philosopher of science, he makes the argument that aboutness can't be analyzed in terms of fundamental physics. And he actually goes from there to say, you know what, though, if thoughts can't be analyzed in terms of fundamental physics, then there can't be any thoughts. Because he makes the argument that in order for there to be thoughts, they would have to be products of fundamental physics. I like that argument. I would just flip it around and say, by introspection, I witness my own thoughts. They exist. I think he's right that thoughts can't be analyzed in terms of fundamental physics. So therefore, there's something that thinks that's not in terms of fundamental physics, and there you go.
If there are no thoughts, we don't exist, as René Descartes put it.
That's right. If you can't even think, right? I mean, how can you think that there are no thoughts, right? And of course, the response is you don't think that there are no thoughts. It's that you have a brain state that thinks star that there are no thoughts, where think star is not thinking, right? So there's a game, there's a verbal game to play here.
Wasn't this the idea of Descartes when he started to say, okay, everything is just doubt everything, and then he started to doubt his own thoughts, and he said, okay, at least I have the doubt.
That's right.
That's why I think that therefore I exist, or something like that. No?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Okay. So next question is about logical impossibilities versus physical impossibilities. I also always hear people saying that, for example, how you say miracles are illogical, like resurrection, for example, is illogical. How would you answer to that?
Yeah, no, I think it depends on how you think of a miracle. I'll just kind of tell you the view that I've arrived at, which is I think of all of reality as governed by order, laws. This is true even when we make decisions. We make decisions for reasons. Okay, there's an order to our decisions. That doesn't mean that these laws are deterministic. And we talked about libertarian free will. I think that laws are indeterministic, that allow beings to make choices. So my view, this is just my model of reality, is that the foundation of reality is a supreme mind. The foundation has a supreme nature and has supreme resources to cause the rest of reality. And this supreme mind then grounds psychological laws and physical laws. So now, just to answer the question, I don't think if it's physically impossible, it's thereby logically impossible. It could be that something's physically impossible just in the sense that it goes against the current physical laws, but it could be a logical possibility to intervene or change those laws. Okay, this is maybe will sound a little bit strange, but I've been thinking a lot about consciousness in my own dreams. So I've actually had dreams where I know that I'm dreaming, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm conscious, and I'm looking out, and I'm experiencing the dreams. And one dream I was having, I was looking out, I saw images of mountains and sky, and I thought, can I change those images? And I began to try to turn the mountains and rotate them in my dream. Now, there's a sense in which you could say there's like a physics even to the consciousness within my dream world. Like if I generate in my mind a conscious image and then I rotate it, it continues to rotate. There's a kind of inertia, even in my own consciousness. Okay. This is the physics of consciousness. I think the physics of our universe is actually a physics of consciousness produced by God. So I actually think then that, in a way, miracles are really just God doing things differently than he's done things. They're not contradictions. They're not really impossibilities. You could even anticipate a miracle if you understand what God desires. If you understand God's intentions, you might anticipate healing, for example. If you think you pray for somebody, it increases the probability that God's consciousness comes in and helps bring healing. This isn't against laws. This isn't against logic. I think this is actually in accordance with the laws of a foundational mind.
Thanks for that. I have another one. This is back to the soul.
Yeah. So would you say that without a soul, organisms such as us would be rather like biological robots without a real consciousness, but that they would mimic consciousness? Yeah, I love that question. I think if we define a soul as a subject of real consciousness, where that real consciousness is not itself analyzed in terms purely of mindless matter, then mindless bits of matter organized in a certain way, then I think absolutely right. Because without a being that is a center of consciousness, all you have are chips that can sort of act conscious or mimic consciousness, but they don't actually have that first person sense of self. I think that's absolutely right. And I think this actually makes sense of our ordinary intuitions. I mean, these Legos, I could stack them up and build a face. And maybe I could program the face to move, and maybe to form a smile so it looks happy. But we know that it wouldn't thereby have the feeling inside of being happy. Merely to act happy is not sufficient for actually being happy. And I think to actually be happy, you actually need the right kind of substance. And the kind of substance is one that's very familiar to us. It's the kind of substance that we know when we look within through introspection and see and witness our own selves having conscious experiences. That's the kind of thing that can actually be conscious. Otherwise, yeah, I think it just mimics consciousness. If I could just say one more thing about this, I've actually been thinking a lot about elements within my mind, like images and thoughts. And I've been thinking that those things surely don't have their own consciousness. So, for example, if I form an image of a face, that image of a face in my mind isn't itself having its own feelings and thoughts. That image is part of me. I'm the one thinking of the image, but the image is in itself having its own thoughts and feelings. And I think of material things exactly the same way. It's not that Legos or brain matter has its own thoughts or feelings, but rather I'm the one having thoughts or feelings. And Legos and brain matter are actually themselves products of a more basic mental powers. Ultimately, the foundation's mental powers provides the ultimate resources for everything else. So that it actually just does, it's no more plausible that rearranging chemicals in a brain could themselves have their own consciousness than it is for rearranging mental images in your mind having their own consciousness. The kind of being that has consciousness is a conscious subject, not bits of mindless matter, if that makes sense.
Yes, it makes sense. Now, this is a bit of a different question. If you can address this also.
How do you distinguish a mostly pantheistic view of God, where necessary existence explains very terse few things of the universe? It is far from Yahweh, Jesus, and the Bible. Well, it is interesting because even in the biblical text, there's this line that it is in Him in whom we move and have our being. Now, pantheism and panentheism are sort of related ideas, which point to the idea of it being in God in whom we live and move and have our being. It's like out of God's substance that we exist. Kind of the way that I would think of it is that the biblical data leaves open a range of options in terms of how God creates. And I think the questioner is absolutely right to point out that there is a difference, of course, between the more specific details of the biblical descriptions of God and the sort of more general characterization of a foundational mind, as I'm pointing to in my argument. And I think that's a nice result, actually, because then it allows us to separate questions. We can actually use reason and evidence wholly apart from religion. We can use science and reason, reflection to think about the fabric of reality, to think about the foundation of reality, to uncover its attributes. And then if we uncover a supreme mind, then we can look further into other candidate revelations of the supreme mind and see if we can get some more details about its interaction with us and with human beings in general.
Thanks. I will share another question. This is about morality and ethics. I'm also interested about this question. So,
can you point out the difference between morality and ethics? So I think of ethics as a general field into right and wrong, good and bad, and value, where that field divides into three broad subfields. So there's metaethics, which deals with the sort of foundations of how there could be value, good, bad, duties, these sorts of moral terms. And then there's normative systems, which isn't so much about how there can be these things, but has to do with the criteria for discerning these things. And then there's applied ethics, which then looks at actual experiences like, what do you do with people at the end of life? How do you, how do you treat them? And your normative ethics and your meta ethics is going to help inform your applied ethics. Although I think it can also go the other way. Your applied ethics can help inform your normative ethics and your meta ethics, the foundation of ethics. So I think a morality is more specific, kind of focusing on moral character and formation, and whereas ethics is more of the study of that divides into those three branches, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I will take the last three questions. That's okay for you?
That sounds great.
Okay, cool. So back to contingency argument. What do you think is the weakest link in the argument? This is a challenge.
I think the weakest link would be the causal principle. And I think actually everything else can be deduced just through basic principles of uncontroversial principles of logic from the causal principle, depending on how you define your terms. So if you set up the causal principle so that you're saying any contingent things or groups of contingent things has some external causal explanation or some prior condition, then I think that you can deduce from there that there has to be this necessary foundation to avoid circularity. So I would say that's kind of where all the action is at, both in the first stage of the argument and in the second stage, because the second stage that uncovers the nature of the foundation further also is going to rely on a kind of causal or dependence principle, that things that are limited or not supreme or finite or blue or turtles have some prior condition. And so I think that would be the weakest link. That's where all the action's at. And that's why I think it's so important to look at the supports for that principle. The supports being both the experience of the causal order, as I mentioned, as well as the expectation of an explanation of things of that sort. So both reason and experience being the kinds of supports for that link in the argument.
This is evil God challenge.
Wonderful.
How can we know that God is not evil?
Mm-hmm.
A super intelligent being can trick us to think he's good, but at the end he can be evil and torture us at the end of the day.
I think, yeah, this is a wonderful question. And I think this points to an asymmetry between good and evil. So my understanding of evil is that it's a departure from prior states of goodness. And that, in fact, there couldn't even be evil without some kind of good. So, for example, like if I tear apart your face and hurt you and you're like, Josh, stop, I'm just tearing. Well, part of what makes that so bad is that you have value. Your face has value. I'm hurting you. And so I actually think that in order for there to be evil, there has to already be some kind of goodness. I had the argument that the foundation of reality would have a supreme nature. If it has a supreme nature, I think that would entail that it would have to be perfectly good. Because if instead it had some kind of evil, then I don't think it would be foundational. I think that evil would itself depend on something prior. The most foundational reality then can't be evil because evil depends on something prior. So the most foundational reality, well, if so that's why God can't be evil, because God's the most foundational reality.
Okay, so basically, this is the view of Augustine, no? Which says that good, evil is a corruption of good at the end of the day.
Yes, that's right. And there's different ways of understanding that
Right.
precisely. If I could just say something else, because something that I like about this question and this challenge, and I've thought a lot about this since graduate school and reading on this topic, is that it's kind of symmetry between a certain defense of theism in response to the problem of evil, and then a defense of this evil God in response to the problem of good. So the way this works is that if you point to evil in the world and you say, there's so much evil in the world, how could God be good? And then you say, well, maybe God has some greater reason for allowing that evil. Then there's a symmetrical argument like, well, maybe God is actually perfectly evil. And you point to all the good and you say, well, maybe this evil being has some devious reason for allowing the good for some greater evil down the road. And I think that is a symmetry. And I think that symmetry does highlight, well, I don't think it highlights a problem at all. It highlights a certain kind of symmetry. But I just want to make the point that that kind of symmetry is completely compatible with the asymmetry that I pointed to, which is that you can't even have good without a prior evil, which I think does break the challenge. I think this is how I answer the challenge. This is why I think fundamental reality is good and not evil.
Yeah. Great.
So it's not because of there being good things in the world that I think fundamental reality is good. That's not my fundamental reason. It's just because the only kind of fundamental reality I think that could be ultimate would have to be one that is supreme to avoid the problem of having to depend on a prior explanation.
Okay. From what I listen to you on YouTube, I hear that you like atheists and agnostic because they ask questions and challenge your views. So
Absolutely.
my next question is, how do you define an atheist and agnostic, and how to interact efficiently with them as a believer?
Efficiently. Yeah. So Michael Martin, an atheist philosopher, coined, I think it came from him, the term strong atheism, which is the belief that there is no God, and then weak atheism, which is the lack of belief in God. And so atheists that I talk with will characterize themselves either as a strong atheist or as a weak atheist. And interestingly, it kind of depends on where I encounter them. If I encounter them in an academic context, it seems like they're more likely to say that there is no God. That's what I mean by atheism. And if I encounter them outside of the academic context, for whatever reason, it seems like they're more likely to say that they lack belief in God. Yes, so the lack
Right.
atheist, and that's fine. Those are two flavors of atheism. And then the agnostic would then lack belief in the existence of God, as well as lack belief in the non-existence of God. And so that's kind of how I would distinguish those. As far as interacting efficiently and effectively, fundamentally for me is I just think of people, as somebody that I can learn from, as somebody that I can have a conversation with, as somebody whom I can value and honor and treasure, just as a person, as an end, as a valuable being, for me, made in the image of the most valuable being. And so I have an ontology that supports me interacting with people in a very positive way, where I treasure them, I honor them. And I'm not treasuring and honoring them as a means to persuade them, because I'm treating them as an end in their own right. And I think that makes all the difference. I think people can feel it if you're kind of using them to persuade them, you're using them to win an argument, you're using them to show that you're smarter than them, or to even prove them wrong. They can feel that, and it doesn't really feel very good. And then I don't think it matters like how great your arguments are. It's not going to be productive. It's not going to be efficient. But I think for me, if I can just go into a conversation, treat them as a person, be ready to learn from them, I make it one of my goals that anybody, whether they believe in God or not, they're going to come away from interacting with me feeling positive, feeling curious, feeling built up, not torn down. And I think that's really what leads to the greatest flow of wisdom from mind to mind, from person to person.
Thank you. There was a first question which I missed at the beginning when I first put the post about you, and someone asked, you publish Plantinga style arguments. How wide are accepted your views in the fields, given a quiet, very low acceptance of Plantinga arguments outside of the conservative inclining universities?
That's interesting. So I do have an argument, an ontological argument that kind of extends Plantinga's ontological argument, provides a way of supporting that. That is a rare road to take. You know, that this isn't something that I would say it's kind of at the edges of our current inquiry. If you sort of think of ontological arguments as being technologies, so the first technologies maybe didn't work very well, and people said, you can't build that technology, it'll never work. And then others came along, well, I'm not so sure, maybe we can tinker with it. And they've kind of kept iterating it. So Plantinga iterated it, and then I've iterated Plantinga's technology. And so this is kind of at the edge. I would say it's maybe too new, it's too recent. It's not even a lot of philosophers know about it. I don't think it really has to do with conservative inclined universities at all, actually. In fact, the philosophers that I work with in the philosophy of religion, whether they believe in God or not, tend not to be affiliated. Well, it depends if you mean politically conservative or religiously conservative. But there tends to be a wide range of views, both politically and religiously. And I would say that the sort of general maybe skepticism of certain forms of the ontological argument spans across those views. At least that's my impression from working with philosophers.
Okay, and this is the final question which I would like to
Sounds
end
great.
with. So this is, how do you know is a Christian God the foundation? And
Yeah.
do you use cumulative argumentation, or you just use this one, and you think it can arrive to the Christian God?
I like the general cumulative approach. I like Swinburne's approach, and he talks about reasons that God would have to become incarnate, to enter into the world. I don't like the word Christian God, only because it makes it sound like, let's see, how do I want to put this? To me, it's almost like saying the Christian 2 + 2 = 4, or the Christian, or the Christian,
Morality.
morality, or something like this. It's like the way that I think about it in my mind is not that there's all these different gods and like, here's the Christian God. The way that I think about it in my mind, this is just very honest, is that there's a foundational reality. This foundational reality is good. It has intelligence, and it is very powerful. In fact, it's supremely powerful. Okay. And different cultures from different traditions are approaching this foundational reality in different ways, have different views about this foundational reality. And then it's a further question about how this reality may have disclosed itself in human history. And that's a big question. But I would argue in sort of the Swinburne style argument that it has reasons to display its love for us, to experience solidarity with the human condition, to enter into human form, to have a kind of incarnation through Christ. And those reasons kind of prep my mind when I look at the historical factors, the sort of cumulative historical factors surrounding particularly the life of Jesus. And so that, for me, makes it compelling. It's like a fingerprint in human history that kind of matches the broad arc of the story. But I want to just emphasize, I think the broad arc of the story is perhaps broader than people from within any particular tradition sometimes imagine. And so people kind of go to war against each other, fighting for this or that concept of God. And I feel like it's kind of maybe part of my heart, my purpose, to help kind of inspire a fresh curiosity from all traditions, from all perspectives, to look again at the foundation of reality and think about its nature, and then think again about how it might relate to us in a fresh way, not looking at it kind of through the lens of a religion, but looking at it maybe through reason and evidence, not discounting the data from traditions, including the data from traditions, including all of it, all the data that you have at your disposal. I think that can just be a helpful way of people kind of coming together in a fresh inquiry. So I guess the short answer would be yes, a cumulative type argument would be my general style.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for asking questions. Now I will prepare the giveaway to do the random extraction. And in the meantime, I will show you some feedbacks about the live. So people loved it. And
Awesome.
also they
Glad.
say they will buy the book. They want you back.
Thank you.
And
you have a wonderful, wonderful audience. They ask wonderful questions, very insightful, very intelligent questions.
Thank you for that. So now I would like to point you back to the description and to see the work of Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. Try to see his site, his website, his YouTube channel, which is very good. And now I will try to do the pickup for the giveaway. I don't know if you can see. I hope you can see the screen. So there were not a lot of people subscribing for this, but maybe because it was in English. I don't know if your book can be sold in Romanian or not. Maybe not for the moment.
Okay.
So let me do the spin. It will be very quick. Cool. We have the winner. Congratulations to Ciprian. He's labeling himself as a strong atheist, and I hope this book will be very helpful to him to see from a different perspective, maybe. So
yeah, I hope that's very glad. I'm glad for that he could win that, and I hope it will be sort of an encouraging book that as he reads it, it would feel like it's an invitation to a journey. And one of the things I really worked hard on in this particular book was to not make it a kind of knockdown against other people's views, but rather to really invite a fresh inquiry. And I always just tell the reader, own the journey. Take what serves you. If there's something in the argument that doesn't seem to add up in your own thinking, trust your own thinking. Follow the light of reason within you, because I think that's the way that you learn the most. That's the way that you're the most powerful. So yeah, I hope this book will serve you.
Thank you for that insight also. So now again, I would like to thank you, Joshua, for coming and for being so humble and accepting this invitation. Honestly, I didn't expect it, so I'm really, really happy that you came. And also, I would like to thank to everybody for watching this evening and for putting very good questions. And now, because you are a guest, I would like you to finish with some words, whatever you want to say to the audience. And
well, just thank you. Yes, thank you, Vasile. This was just wonderful. I mean, this is just so beautiful how you put this all together from beginning to end. It's just an honor to be part of this. And I also was excited that I was able to put together a presentation just for your audience. It kind of inspired me to kind of organize my thoughts in a particular way for your audience. So I appreciate that opportunity. So yeah, just thank you. Appreciate your work.
Okay, thank you everyone, and hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.